Chapter 51. They were heading north again, back to Grimmsdale Wood. It was only fair, Will thought, that they should escort Malcolm home. He had been prepared to do this on his own, but Halt had announced that they would all make the trip. "You can see Malcolm back to his forest," he said. "Horace and I have some business at Castle Mackindor." Will looked curiously at him for a few moments, not understanding. Then Halt explained. "The outlaw band that's been working with Tennyson are still at large," he said. "They'll need to be rounded up. We'll arrange for a patrol from Mackindor to take care of it. Harrison can lead them. He's probably itching for something to do." Harrison was the newly appointed ranger to Norgate Fife, Will remembered. The appointment had been announced at the gathering. He shook his head. It seemed so long since the gathering. So much had happened in the intervening time. They had found the horses Tennyson and his men had appropriated, grazing in a meadow close by the ruined cavern system. They took the quietest for Malcolm. As was often the case, the quietest horse was also the biggest, and the little healer perched on top of it, his legs not reaching round the barrel of the horse's body, but sticking straight out. Before they left, Halt had addressed the ex-converts to the outsiders' cult, lecturing them on the need to be more suspicious of religious leaders who offered to solve all their problems in return for their gold. The people hung their heads and shuffled their feet in embarrassment, and he finally dismissed them to return to their farms. "Looks like they've learned their lesson," Horace said. Halt snorted dismissively. Right until the next charlatan arrives and promises them heaven on earth." Malcolm smiled at his cynicism. "You don't have a great deal of respect for your fellow man's common sense, do you?" Halt shook his head. "I've been around too long. Greed and fear will always win out over common sense." Malcolm nodded his agreement. His own experience bore out the truth of Halt's words. "I'm afraid you're right." "How long before they're all back here, do you think?" Will asked. Horace looked at him, not understanding. "What would they come back here for?" Will grinned at him. "Their gold," he said. "It's buried under that cliff there, remember? I wager they'll be back here digging for it within a week." Horace laughed, understanding. "That should keep them busy for the next 10 years or so." So they rode north, and several days later they saw the solid bulk of Castle Mackindor before them, crouching astride the entry route from Pictor, barring the way to the fierce northern tribes. Halt turned in his saddle to face Malcolm. "In all the excitement," he said, "I may have forgotten something important. Thank you for saving my life," he said simply. Malcolm smiled. "It was my pleasure," he said. "I always enjoy rubbing shoulders with legends." But Halt wasn't going to let Malcolm pass it off so casually. "Nonetheless, if you ever need help in any form, send for me. I'll come. You have my word on it." Malcolm grew serious. He met Halt's steady gaze and nodded once. "I'll remember it," he said. The two men clasped hands in farewell. They held the grip for long seconds. Then Malcolm released Halt's hand and turned to Horace, the smile creeping back onto his face. "As for you, Horace, try to stay out of trouble, won't you? And don't eat poor Xander out of house and home." Xander was the steward at Mackindor, and he guarded the castle lord's supplies more keenly than a miser would hoard his gold. Horace grinned in return and shook hands. "Thanks for everything, Malcolm. If it hadn't been for you, Will and I would never be able to face Lady Pauline again." "I'm going to have to meet this remarkable woman one of these days," he said. "Come on then, Will. There are people waiting to see you again." And as Halt and Horace continued north, Will and the little healer angled their horses off to the east, and the dark line on the horizon that marked the beginning of Grimmsdale Wood. As they rode in under the dark canopy once more, Will marvelled at Malcolm's sure sense of direction. Once they were surrounded by the tangle of trees and foliage, with no sign of the sun, Will rapidly lost his orientation. But Malcolm pressed on, and in a surprisingly short space of time, they emerged into the clearing where Malcolm's thatched cottage stood. First to greet them was a black and white shape who slipped across the clearing towards them, heavy tail sweeping back and forth. Tug whinnied a short greeting, and Will swung down from the saddle to fondle the dog's head and the soft fur under her chin and neck. She closed her eyes blissfully at his touch. A massive shadow fell over him, and he glanced up. "Hello, Trobar," he said. "You're taking good care of her. She looks wonderful." Indeed, Shadow was sleek and glossy, and her long coat was obviously groomed regularly. Trobar smiled at the compliment to his best friend. "Welcome, Will Treaty," he said, his words distorted by the deformation of his mouth and palate. Will stood, and Trobar enveloped him in a bone-crushing hug. Malcolm smiled at the contrast between the slightly built ranger and the massive Trobar. Then more familiar faces emerged shyly from the trees around the clearing, and Will greeted them all, noticing their smiles as he remembered names and events that had taken place on his previous visit. Under Trobar's direction, a table was set up in the middle of the clearing, and food was prepared. An impromptu feast ensued and lasted until long after sunset. Will looked around at these happy, welcoming people. They had been rejected by the world outside because of their infirmities or the fact that their bodies were deformed. Because they were different, he thought. But really, that was a falsehood. These people were no different to any others. Eventually, exhausted by the feast and the days of travel, he took himself off to bed in the spare room in Malcolm's cabin. As he drifted off to sleep, he could hear the distant hooting of an owl somewhere in the forest and the soft whisper of the wind in the trees. He bade farewell to Malcolm early the following morning, before too many of the inhabitants of Healer's Clearing were up and moving. "You know how much I owe you," he said. "I want to thank you, not just for what you did, but for the way you did it." Malcolm frowned, not quite understanding, so Will elaborated. "I arrived here unannounced, asking for help for a friend miles away. You didn't ask questions. You didn't hesitate. You packed your things and came with me." The frown disappeared. "We're friends," Malcolm said simply. "That's what friends do for each other. Just remember what Halt said. If you ever need help, I'll send for the two of you." Malcolm embraced Will quickly. "Good luck, Will. Travel safely. I'd say stay out of trouble, but I doubt you'll ever do that." Will stepped back. He always felt awkward at farewells. He turned towards Tug, saddled and ready to go. But a voice stopped him. "Will Treaty!" It was Trobar, standing on the far side of the clearing. He was beckoning to Will. Malcolm smiled at some secret knowledge. "I think Trobar has something to show you," he said. Will started across the clearing towards the giant. Something was amiss, he thought. Then he realized what it was. There was no sign of Shadow, who usually never let Trobar out of her sight. As Will drew closer, Trobar turned and led him in under the trees. A few meters inside the tree line, a low hut stood. Will realized this was where Trobar slept. Off to one side was a smaller structure, barely a meter high, with a large opening facing them. Trobar gestured towards it, and Will went down on his knees to peer inside. Shadow's blue and brown eyes looked back at him, and he saw the slow wag of her tail. Then he saw other movement as well, and made out 4 small black and white shapes tumbling around her, climbing over her, fastening their needle-sharp teeth on any loose part of her flesh they could find. "Puppies!" he said in delight. "She's had puppies!" Trobar grinned at him and reached one giant hand into the kennel. Gently pushing the others aside, he took hold of one and lifted her, yipping in excitement, out of the kennel. Shadow watched him carefully as he held the little ball of black and white fluff out to Will. "Pick of the litter," he said, and for a moment Will frowned, trying to decipher the words. Then he had it. When he had left Shadow with Trobar, he had told the giant, "If she ever has pups, I want the pick of the litter." "Pick of the litter?" he translated now, and Trobar beamed, holding the little squirming shape out to him. "For you, Will Treaty." He took the pup, who immediately fastened her teeth on the ball of his thumb, growling and yipping alternately. He studied her. She was still covered in soft puppy fur, and her tail, which would later become a bushy, slow-sweeping extension of her body, was now a whip-shaped narrow affair with a white tip at the end. She glared at him, and he laughed in delight as he saw that she had inherited her mother's eyes, one blue, one brown. The blue eye had a peculiar, manic look to it. He smoothed the fur on her head, and she stopped worrying at his thumb. The whip-tail went back and forth in pleasure. "She's beautiful," he said. "Thanks, Trobar. Thank you so much." He grinned down at the struggling little pup. "I wonder what I should call her," he mused. "Ebony," Trobar said firmly. "Her name is Ebony." Again, Will frowned as he tried to interpret the word. Then he had it. "Ebony," he said, and Trobar grinned confirmation. "That's a good name. I like it." Then Trobar, still grinning, said, "Better than Blackie." "Better than Blackie?" Will asked. That was the first name he had come up with for Shadow. Trobar had been scathing about it when he renamed the dog. Trobar nodded vigorously. "I suppose I'll never live that down, will I?" Will asked. "Never," Trobar replied with great conviction. He smiled down at the pup, then put a massive hand on Will's shoulder. "Never," he repeated. Will raised an eyebrow at him. "I got it the first time," he said.